We will be picking up on Chapter 3 on Trance, Formation of America, the true life story of a CIA mind control slave by Kathy O'Brien with Mark Phillips. The reclamation of Kathy's mind. The greatest gift anyone can give another is a good memory. It was now the week after Christmas 1988. I was fulfilling half of my pledge to the Vegas mob. With all our remaining personal belongings containerized and secretly in transit on a different ship, I, my new family, and pets were ferry bound for Anchorage, Alaska. The 1,600-mile trip through ice and snow would take about 3 days to complete. Unfortunately, it gave me time to think. Due to our negative cash flow situation, realistically, I knew there was no place to run or hide from the CIA. Kathy and Kelly seemed happy and believed they were safe. This was my number one priority. For me, I had to trust that my escape plan would convince interested CIA personnel that we no longer represented a threat to their security. The plan was based on an ancient psychological warfare formula developed by the Romans. I was to portray myself akin to a character in a bad Reagan Western movie and ride into the sunset, never to be heard from again. Thinking to myself that where we were headed geographically, there was no sun to set, at least until spring. Late one night, about midway into our voyage, I sought the solitude that the outside night... I'm sorry, this text is so small and together. Thinking to myself that we were headed geographically, there was no sun to set, at least until spring. Late one night, about midway into our voyage, I sought the solitude that the outside forward deck would afford me. I was thankful for the wind-driven sleet and snow that stung and closed my eyes and opened my mind for focused thought. At the time, I was psychologically strung out from a combination of rage and unbearable emotional heartache. To safeguard my precious teenage son, Mason, from being hurt and or unwittingly unused as a pawn to force me to remain silent, I had virtually destroyed our father-son bond. I loved and missed him very much and still do. The resultant emotional pain from the deception and separation seemed to be compounding within me and was consuming my being. I had in the course of rescuing Kathy and Kelly, shunned and insulted my son, collapsed my company, simultaneously orchestrated 2 divorces, and sold all personal treasures. I worried I would never see my elderly mother again. Her health was deteriorating. The tailored clothes I wore no longer fit me, as I had lost over 40 pounds and looked skeletal. Chronic insomnia, a symptom of severe depression, I secretly felt was slowly driving me mad. My own short-term memory was beginning to fail. I had noticed for the first time in over 30 years that I was stuttering when enunciating certain words. I knew this was just the beginning of a long and dangerous expedition in search of answers. As I stood alone, with eyes closed on the ship's ice-covered steel deck, a strange feeling of relief washed over me. I had somehow managed to remember from where I could draw emergency strength. I began silently praying for inner strength and guidance through a meditation technique I'd learned years ago, probably the Gateway Experience method. Immediately, I experienced a feeling of peaceful self-assurance that we would survive to tell our story. Suddenly, I became aware that the icy wind was freezing my face and hands. I was elated that I could feel again. Apparently, I had repressed my tactical senses along with my emotions. For the first time, I learned of Kathy and Kelly's mind control existence. I felt functionally alive. I opened my eyes to discover I wasn't alone anymore. A voice was coming from somewhere. I looked around and saw, crouched down and wrapped in a dark green blanket almost beside me, the source of the voice. Again, I heard, "Hey man, you okay?" The good man whom I later came to know and respect was Mark Demont. He was a classic example of what Alaskans term as sourdough. Roughly defined as sourdough was anybody from the lower 48 states who was disenchanted with their home and low on money. We were both sourdoughs and refugees from a sick society gone mad from CIA drugs, media violence, and uncontrolled greed. I offered him a cigarette and my hand in friendship, something I had not done voluntarily in almost a year. We agreed to stay in contact after our arrival. About 2 days later, we landed safely at the Anchorage docks. We were told by the ferry's captain that it was the coldest day of the decade. The ship's thermometer read a minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. For me, this was an anticipated weather condition, and for Kathy and Kelly, a physical challenge. I had spent about 2 years in Alaska around 1980. It was then that I helped my former boss from Capital International Airways, CIA, George Kamatz, put a new carrier online known briefly as Great Northern Airlines. I left Alaska back then, not because of the environment, which I loved, but due to my inability to cope with Kamatz's daily tirades. This rigid fellow had a long, colorful history for working CIA-controlled airlines. Among other jobs, he had held top executive positions of authority with the infamous Air Support Section of the U.S. Forestry Service, Air America, and Evergreen CIA carriers. Now I was back in Alaska, unemployed and knowing I was being tracked like an animal by the same organization I had previously indirectly worked for, the Central Intelligence Agency. After seeing the past couple of nights, I was feeling much better, and thoughts of being tracked did not concern me. I recall having more productive things on my mind. I could not allow raw fear to become any part of my daily diet of thought process. Kathy and I dedicated every possible moment to locate a house we could call home. We finally found a fourplex apartment that was inexpensive, with 2 bedrooms and a heating garage. We had to have a heated garage for my 3 beloved pet raccoons and dogs. Our new home would never have furniture beyond a TV, 2 beds, and a table and chairs. This inconvenience was discussed. We were comfortable. After settling in our new place in the remote rural town of Chiguac, we immediately began doing normal things. We enrolled Kelly in a great public school, met our new neighbors, and played in the snow. All of this was being enjoyed in a traditional family way, something Kathy and Kelly had never been known before. Our remaining meager resources were disappearing before my eyes. The cost of asthma medication that Kelly now required to keep her alive was over $400 per month. I strongly suspected that much of the reason for her declining health resulted from the 2 weeks in hell she had recently spent with alleged serial killer Wayne Cox. She told me so by detailing the hideous satanic rituals she and her 4-year-old stepbrother Jacob had been subjected to. Fortunately, I had held onto my expensive Nikon camera, guns, and personal jewelry items. These were the last real assets I had remaining to sell. I sold them, and the proceeds paid our living expenses for 5 more months until Kelly's health needs and circumstances forced us on welfare. During this 5 month period, Kelly in school and no telephone to distract us, I began intensifying my deprogramming efforts with Kathy. Most days, our work started the moment we returned home from taking Kelly to school. As soon as Kelly was in bed at night after dinner and homework, we resumed our session. We worked like this day and night, 7 days a week, focused intensely on the deprogramming process until I would pass out from exhaustion around 3 o'clock in the morning. The deprogramming formula for putting Kathy's fragmented mind back together was inherently free of problems. The small problem I did experience with the formula stemmed from having to expertly apply it based on my educated memory of almost 20 years previous. I had no communication with any recognized authority or other than Corey Hammond to guide the initial therapy. My greatest challenge was to learn how to control Kathy's constant state of trance as she journaled her memories. In spite of reporting to the FBI that I was a hypnotist, I knew that if the FBI and CIA could prove through my admissions I was using hypnosis on Kathy, her testimony in court would be worthless. Therefore, the threat of reprisal from the CIA was averted. In fact, through my own intensive research of hypnotherapy, I learned how to control Kathy's trance states. I regarded it as unhypnotizing her. Eventually, I would be regarded by mental health physicians as an expert in the application of this little-used clinical tool for recovering memory. Aside from my learned deprogramming skill, the balance of the formula I used consisted of elements which are actually rules of ethical therapy conduct. These therapy rules were strictly enforced. Kathy understood and agreed that, in order for her to have absolute control of her mind, she must place total control in me and the therapy regimen. I maintained a constant vigil to ensure Kathy's physical and psychological safety from all outside influences. That was number one. Number two, no memories could be verbalized by Kathy until after they were written by her. The question I could ask were history-oriented and directed to Kathy's presenting personality that was recovering the memory. Those questions could only address the who, what, when, how, and where of the memory. Even if I could have known the answer in advance, I could not inject. Our perceptions would have differed radically and could have created more memory barriers between personality fragments. Number three, I fundamentally explained mind control to Kathy, and she then understood that what happened to her was not her fault. However, she understood she was becoming responsible for her actions here and now. Through therapy, she was asserting control over her own mind. Number four, we devoted many hours to intellectual discussions of Kathy's learned religious beliefs, and they were logically debunked, just as if I were explaining how the illusions of a magician's tricks worked to confuse reality. Number five, no expression of emotion by Kathy would be permitted during the memory recovery and journaling process. I never asked her, "How does that make you feel?" This is as important as the safety issue for the rapid recovery of memories. Number six, I provided Kathy adequate food, vitamins, water, and sleep to restore her failing physical health. Number 7. I taught Kathy how to view her memories on a mind movie screen rather than re-experience them through a mind's virtual reality mechanism. Number 8. I instructed Kathy how to trance herself and control the depth of her trance state through self-hypnosis techniques, some regarded as meditation. This was put in place to avoid possible contamination and or confusion of her memories, which might have happened had I used a hypnotic induction technique known as guided imagery. Number 9. Kathy was not allowed to read books, newspapers, or magazines, to watch TV, or to discuss with Kelly anything she recalled. Kathy had experienced a lifetime of information control and thereafter had minimal contamination of memory of sort through. Maybe that was thorough. And had minimal contamination of memory to sort through. Yeah. This rule was understood and respected by Kelly, whose memories were beginning to surface. Number 10. All behavioral patterns and social habits Kathy exhibited were re-examined through logical discussion between us. All pre-established behavior patterns, including daily routines, were rescheduled or stopped completely. Number 11. I required her to wear a wristwatch 24 hours a day to alert me of any lost time she felt she was experiencing. Losing time without trauma is a sort of indication that personality switching is occurring, whereas being able to account for time is an indicator that recovery is occurring. The memories Kathy was recovering were horrible beyond anything I had ever heard anyone speak about. I often wondered if I had fallen in love with Kathy as a result of my developing the psychological malady known as the Stockholm Syndrome. Those thoughts never bothered me, for I knew I had grown to love Kathy. I had heard enough horror from Kathy and Kelly to know I was now suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms of this disorder went unnoticed by Kathy and Kelly because they too were PTSD'd and had been all their lives. My own health began to deteriorate rapidly. My regained body weight began to melt away once again. I was experiencing incredible stomach pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. I was literally living on patient. I was literally living on patient medicine known to ulcer sufferers as Malox. A secure phone to call a doctor friend in the lower 48 produced the name of a local international medicine specialist I could trust. Aware of my predicament, my physician friend made the appointment on my behalf for this doctor to prepare certain in-office tests. One of the tests, using a fiber optic stomach tube, showed that as a result of a waterborne parasite, there were 3 holes in the walls of my stomach. I had recommended emergency surgery. I replied, no. He recommended emergency surgery. I replied, no. How much longer can I live with this before surgery? He said, it depends on how well you can follow my instructions. No problem, I said. Within a few days of feeding myself intravenously and taking the prescribed medications, I began to recover. It was during this recovery period that I began to telephone search for answers to speed Kathy's recovery process. Again, I was told by my former well-connected associates that I knew it all. I was not convinced. However, my persistence soon paid off as one particular phone call resulted in my striking proverbial pay dirt. The medical books on clandestine experimental research for treating dissociative disorder mysteriously disappeared on hold for me at the Eagle River branch of the Anchorage Public Library. I was covertly alerted to pick them up on a certain day at an exact time. I complied. As I was leaving the library, a middle-aged woman with a grocery sack in her arms approached me. She asked if the library was open. I thought this odd since I was walking out the opened I thought this odd since I was walking out the opened library entrance. My curiosity was short-lived when she asked, "Have you read any good books by Dr. Milton Erickson lately?" I replied no, but I am checking one out by psychiatrist William Kroger entitled Clinical Experiment Hypnosis. "Oh yes," she said, "I'm a real fan of Dr. Kroger's, and he is a real fan of Dr. Erickson, who you know is considered the father of subliminal mind control theory research." She began walking away and turned and smiled and said, "Enjoy your books and use the bookmark. I assumed she was addressing me by name while referring to the book itself. I concluded from this comment that she was obviously the person responsible for delivering the books to the library. Soon I learned she was referring to a bookmark placed inside one of the books, which provided me a desperately needed communications vehicle. Recorded on the bookmark was a toll-free 800 number with a time and date to use it. I used this 800 number, and many others similarly provided me, for a communications vehicle to covertly access spooks, spies, subway to information. Subway to information. For 2 more years, this method provided me with telephonic guidance through a maze of mind work with Kathy. When I called the bookmark 800 number, it was answered by an electronic voice which said in part, "Please enter your employee number now." I complied. Using a series of numbers that I had been previously assigned by someone who must remain anonymous because I do not know their identity, the next sound I heard was that of a phone being rung. After exactly 8 rings, my call was answered. After about 8 rings, oh damn it! It's such small text. It's so easy to get lost. I complied, using a series of numbers that I had been previously assigned by someone who must remain anonymous because I do not know their identity. The next sound I heard was that of a phone being rung. After exactly 8 rings, I felt like a vacuum cleaner salesman with his foot in the door delivering a canned sales presentation. I began nervously emphasizing my desperate need for a quicker therapy regimen for Kathy. The voice asked, "Have you read the books?" "Yes," I replied, but many of the clinical terms were foreign to me. The voice then instructed me to go back to the library and pick up a psych reference book on term definitions. I interrupted his instruction to ask if I could speak with somebody who could make this deprogramming process go faster. He said, "Well, there are only two deprogrammers in this country, one in Boston, Massachusetts, and the other in Phoenix, Arizona. And neither one could be of much help or be trusted with the kind of information you are getting from Kathy." He hesitated and then said, "You're going to need a referral, which I can't provide, but you know how to do it." I asked, "A referral for what?" "To have the chance to speak with the doctor who knows about this and might be of some value," he told me. "Okay," I said. "Who's the doctor?" "Corey Hammond, out of Salt Lake City, Utah." "Geez," I said. "That's Mormon headquarters." "And that was the last religious trauma base for Kathy." "Yes," the voice continued. "But you can trust this doctor if you're careful and don't give up too much information on yourself. He's paranoid like all the rest who know about mind control atrocities. But he could be of some help." "Oh, be alert. Everybody's watching this guy. Anything you say, the bad guys will know." "Thank you very much," I replied. Somewhere in the process of finding a referral professionally acquainted with Somewhere in the process of finding a referral professionally acquainted with Dr. Hammond, I told dissociative disorders specialist Dr. Bennett Braun, a well-known and published psychiatrist in Chicago, Illinois. I learned from our conversation that he had the entire hospital unit dedicated to therapy for people like Kathy and Kelly. I wondered at the time why his name wasn't previously provided to me for a consultation. As a result of this brief telephone encounter, I learned that Dr. Braun had a number of patients on a long waiting list for a bed within this facility. The doctor then provided me the name and telephone number of a friend he confided in, People Magazine senior investigative reporter Sevia Tamarkin. Contacting the People Time Life magazine reporter was to be my biggest single judgment error in the pursuit of helpful information. I would soon learn she was indirectly responsible for nearly costing me my life and did indirectly cost Kelly her chance for expert therapy, which is another book in itself. When I first spoke with Sevia, she dropped important names like a maple tree drops leaves after a frost. I audio tape recorded practically all conversations with the seemingly well-informed source, and then in the years to follow, Sevia first provided me the name and phone number of the Boston deprogrammer, an ex-Mooney programmer by the name of Stephen Hansen. Next, she provided the name and phone number to contact Jolene Jolly West at UCLA. Reluctantly, she gave me the referral I needed to communicate with Dr. Coley Hammond. The later contact the only briefly the later contact being the only briefly helpful one with whom I would speak. Maximizing the PTSD impaired judgment, I telephoned programmer Steve Hansen for advice on how to help Kelly, only which resulted in his coming to our home in Alaska. Apparently, his agenda was to traumatize Kathy by using a well-known code to trigger her to run for her life from me. The method he employed could have been effective, but fortunately for Kathy and Kelly, his robotic delivery, like his moral ethics, was very poor. I learned that Hansen's voice and recorded professional respect for his UCLA psychiatrist friends, Dr. West and Dr. Margaret Singer, derived from sinister reasons. I gotta read that over again. I learned that Hanson's voice and recorded professional respect for his UCLA psychiatrist friends, Dr. West and Dr. Margaret Singer, derived from sinister reasons. Little did I know that Dr. West had worked for the CIA in Project MKUltra mind control research for decades. It seemed some of Dr. West's CIA-supported research had been exposed by a congressional investigator of MKUltra in the 1970s. However, he survived the public scrutiny because the U.S. government had, in essence, halted further investigation of him and his work under the national security guise. His only reported crime was for killing an elephant with an overdose of LSD in the presence of school children. The facts I would learn after Kathy and I spoke with him by phone and subsequent disaster struck us. This too is another story in itself. The phone calls between myself and Dr. Corey Hammond were informative and supportive. He proved himself to be the single most valuable live informant asset I would know in my quest for expert therapy advice. Later, Dr. Hammond delivered to the mental health community through a symposium presentation in 1991, the whole truth as he knew it on the topic of mind control, his advisory instruction to me on a particular Erickson technique for painless, non-abreactive memory recovery called revivification literally saved my precious Kathy from reliving the horrors as she remembered them. This man is my personal hero. Spring in Alaska was a very different experience from what I accustomed to in Tennessee. The Alaskans just refer to it as breakup. In the place of hearing the sounds of chirping birds, I listened to drip noises from the ice melting off everything. The streets had become an ugly brown mush. For spring, as normally a welcomed season change, it was depressing to say the least. The only good news was that the days had slowly changed from darkness to warm sunlight. With this seasonal change, a time bomb I did not know existed began to count down. Kelly's asthma and behavior were radically deteriorating for no apparent reason. One Friday morning in May, Kathy received a call from Kelly's school principal requesting we pick her up as soon as possible and have her examined by a doctor. The school nurse said Kelly was having a severe asthma attack that did not respond to medication she had with her. We picked her up only to find that her condition seemed to improve miraculously at the sight of us. But this improvement would be short-lived. The following Sunday, Kelly's coughing became almost constant. She had exhausted our supply of an important asthma medication, which she regularly used in her respirator pump. I covertly substituted distilled water and sat with her while she struggled for her breath. Using an Erickson technique of guided imagery, I began telling her a story about a little girl who huffed and puffed and climbed a mountain. The story I told ended with the little girl reaching the top of the mountain, only to be so tired that she fell asleep in a bed of wild flowers. Kelly responded by breathing normally and actually falling into a sound sleep for a few hours, only to awaken and repeat her coughing spell. I returned to her bedside, and I asked why she coughed. Kelly, somewhat agitated, responded, "I have asthma." I repeated the water substitution trick as she responded favorably and said, "Dad, Wayne, the father an alleged serial killer Satanist told me I was going to die." I said, "Well, he's not a doctor." Kelly continued, "He really did say that over and over and over again." I then asked, "When did he say this?" "When school's out," she replied. I asked, "What do you mean?" She robotically repeated, "When school's out." "Do you remember when Wayne said this to you?" I asked. "In bed," she continued. He thought I was asleep, and he was talking on the phone to Alex Houston and then to me. I knew Wayne Cox had programmed her to die using a clinical technique known as hypnosleep. Alex Houston was guiding Cox through the program. I interrupted her as I saw she was entering a deep state of trance and responded, "Well, school's not out, and tomorrow you will be well enough to go back to school." As I suggested, Kelly did feel good the next morning and returned to school. This day would be her last day in Birchwood Elementary. Only a few hours passed before Kathy and I again were called, this time by the nurse, who became agitated when Kathy truthfully answered her question. "Didn't you take her to the doctor?" Kathy said, "No, but we will." Later that evening, Kathy, Kelly, and I would make the last of our emergency drives to seek medical help for Kathy. At Anchorage's Humana Hospital, Kathy and I met with the young, very bright and beautiful physician, Dr. Laurie Shepard, who seemed perplexed and perhaps frightened as to Kelly's unexplainable deteriorating condition. I requested a private meeting, and she complied. After about 30 minutes of my explaining what Kathy and Kelly had been rescued from, I defined mind control for her. Learning this, Dr. Shepard then consulted with a local female psychiatrist, Dr. Pat Patrick, to evaluate Kelly. The evaluation was completed, and Dr. Patrick invited Kathy and eventually me to her office for a consultation. This was to be Kelly's first official evaluation that indicated she suffered from multiple personality disorder, MPD, a serious psychological disorder resulting from severe and repeated trauma. I then asked Dr. Patrick if I could arrange for a sexual abuse specialist to verify if Kelly had been abused. She complied. The results were positive. Dr. Patrick, and Kathy seemed almost relieved at this validation. The results sickened me. Kelly's asthma stabilized at Humana, and she was transferred to Charter North Psychiatric Hospital for hospital care. Dr. Patrick apparently provided the best care she knew. Unfortunately, it was adequate. Months passed, and the state of Alaska welfare authorities began to realize Kelly was not improving, and her ineffective care costs were mounting by the thousands of dollars weekly. Dr. Patrick, Kathy, and I, with the cooperation of the Tennessee Violent Crimes Claims Commission, began searching for a hospital that would accept medical insurance. Finally, one was located in Owensboro, Kentucky, which advertised a specialty in working with ritually abused children. Kelly was transferred to this facility, and the state of Alaska paid all the bills for her to move there. Later, we would learn that this elegant hospital facility was nothing more than a human warehouse that collected whatever fees the federal and state government would pay them per child resident. A pretty place to see, but the care for Kelly would prove to be less than nothing. During the summer before Kelly was transferred to this Kentucky hospital, and Kathy was recovering satisfactorily. I felt it was safe to leave their side so that I could find work. We desperately needed money to travel, to live, and to return to the lower 48 with Kelly in the winter. I quickly secured a job at Alaska Business College as an interviewer for prospective students. My sales performance resulted in my being promoted in 2 weeks from an admissions representative to director of admissions. I banked as much money as possible from my earnings over the next 5 months to provide for our move, to be closer to Kelly. The thought of the separation agony that would exist between Kathy and Kelly served as a reminder of my ongoing separation from my son, whom I had not heard from in almost a year. Kathy, on ill advice from me, called her father and begged for some financial help for Kelly's sake. Her father wired $500 to confirm our location and commented, "This is America. Unless you come back to Michigan alone. This is America. Unless you come back to Michigan alone, no more money." It was this statement that triggered Kathy's repressed memories of her own tortured childhood by this alleged pervert and slave salesman, Earl O'Brien. Soon the FBI telephoned Kathy and told her that she needed to voluntarily come to the Anchorage FBI office for questioning. Upon arrival, Kathy informed me that she was under federal investigation for attempting to extort money from her father. Kathy looked strangely relieved when she heard these charges. Later, I would learn that she felt better knowing for sure she was not crazy or delusional, and that her father did in fact do those things to her and her brothers and sisters. The FBI agent was openly sympathetic and reportedly the DOJ-inspired investigation was subsequently dropped upon his recommendation. This agent went on to secure a cash donation through his Mormon church that enabled us to leave his jurisdiction. It is noteworthy that during this same time, through another special agent at the Anchorage FBI office, I was interrogated for what I knew regarding an unrelated crime involving my ex-wife and her lawyer's boss in Florida. I knew nothing. I now know that the FBI was, in effect, attempting to destroy my credibility as an advocate for Kathy and Kelly through their investigation efforts of me. Their case against my ex-wife and lawyer was solved, and her lawyer accomplice was convicted of first-degree murder. My ex-wife became a state's witness and was acquitted. However, days later, I would see my ex-wife being arrested and processed on the popular national television show Unsolved Mysteries. That unfortunate case involved only one homicide and made the national news for weeks to come. In contrary, Kathy's testimony with proofs and provided FBI officials was filed and deliberately covered up for reasons of national security. The national security spell. The fall season in Alaska was now quickly giving into winter, and the termination dust snow was recoating the surrounding mountains. The air was definitely becoming nippy. The change of seasons signaled another change within my new family. Kelly was going to be soon transferred to the Kentucky Vale Institution of Psychiatry, VIP. Kathy and I had been saving every dollar I could earn during my brief tenure at Alaska Business College in preparation for our move back to the lower 48. I realized now that Kathy had gone into a state of recovery known as fusion. She had long since stopped switching personalities and had become a beautiful, intelligent, and logical lady. She was no longer susceptible to anyone triggering her to go against or away from me. She continued to journal her traumatic memories and was professionally adjudged stable. The passage on ships and ferries out of Anchorage to Seattle was booked solid for months ahead. They would only accept freight and or vehicles. I purchased 2 one-way tickets on Alaska Airlines and brought our family car, a 1976 AMC Pacer, and remaining belongings to Anchorage docks for shipment. Suddenly, as we packed our bags and were ready to board our flight, a nearby volcano erupted and halted all air traffic in our out of Anchorage for the following 2 weeks. We waited anxiously for the airport to reopen. We would leave first and Kelly and her nurse would soon follow. This would be the first step of what would be an endless journey in our pursuit of justice. And that's it for today.